Gejuntif, everyone. Tonight I am offering the second half of the two-part sermon that I began on Rosh Hashanah, in which I'm reflecting on the twin liberties upon which our congregation was founded, the freedom of the pulpit and the freedom of the pew, and exploring the ways in which both pulpit and pew have responded to our current moment in history, politics, and culture. On Rosh Hashanah, we examined together the larger American Jewish community, considered its demography and reviewed the integrity of its communal institutions, and considered the successful ways in which we have used technology to enrich and enliven our religious lives. Tonight, my remarks will be a bit more personal. Tonight, I speak to you about my view from the pulpit and about what it's been like to serve a congregation through the turbulence of the past couple of years. When I reflect on the effect that this particular time in history has had on American clergy, I feel worried. I feel worried about the future of the work we do and worried about my colleagues. It is a difficult time to do this job. I can't remember another time when it was more important for us to offer care to so many people who are in so much pain in our congregation and across our nation. And this work has been made even more difficult by the fact that so many of us are hurting too. I've been joking over the last couple years that when the history of this pandemic is finally written, one chapter of the book should be titled, "I Didn't Sign Up for This." It has been a constant exercise in redirection and improvisation. When schools were closed, parents had to serve as their kids' teachers. When schools reopened, teachers had to act as healthcare workers. When hospitals were flooded and ICUs overwhelmed, healthcare workers had to act as traffic cops and grief counselors. None of us are doing the jobs we signed up for. The Jewish world has shifted in similar ways as well. Synagogues closed, reopened, and closed again. Clergy and congregants alike had to adjust to the new reality at each step. And in the contraction of Jewish communal life, many of us lost some of the core spiritual practices that led us to the rabbinate in the first place, devotional regimens of personal prayer and meditation, studying Torah, doing works of charity, visiting the sick. Many of us experienced burnout and depletion that resisted replenishment even by the core practices that make us who we are. And in the absence of those core practices, other parts of our work expanded to fill the space left over, sourcing masks and PPE for our communities, connecting people to testing and vaccination sites, providing online technical support for the less savvy of our internet worshipers. At the same time that we were responding to the pandemic-related needs of our community, we were also frequently asked to respond to the patterns of political upheaval swirling through our country, or asked to stay out of them. Within the same week, I might get one email saying, "I hope you'll use your sermons to respond to the current issues in politics." And another one saying, "I hope you'll remember that the synagogue is no place for politics." It soon became clear that a big question was starting to emerge, one which hasn't yet been resolved, but which highlights a major divide running through the American rabbinate. What is the appropriate place for politics in the American synagogue? What mandate is there for Jewish leaders to get involved in politics? What are the proper boundaries and proportions within which we might do so? In April of 2018, Father Patrick Conroy earned the dubious distinction of becoming the first chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives to be fired from his job. Father Conroy's termination resulted from a sermon he gave in which he urged Congress to consider the needs of the poor. The sermon seems to have been a bit too provocative for some members' tastes. According to Father Conroy, soon after he delivered that sermon, the Speaker of the House appeared in his office and relieved him of his post, telling the priest, quote, "Padre, you just got to stay out of politics." Now, I don't believe that concern for the poor is a partisan affectation. But if the Speaker of the House feels that way, then it would indeed be inappropriate for the chaplain to deliver that sermon. And it should be no surprise that Father Conroy had to leave his job. Now, I've heard similar concerns from people who worry that their church or their synagogue is too political. Sometimes this is a roundabout way of saying that the ideas they hear there are scraping up against their own politics in a way that feels uncomfortable. And so they hope that the list of religiously permissible viewpoints on that pulpit will be made as small as possible. If our synagogue were to make a similar determination, that it would be a gesture of excessive partisanship for our rabbis to express concern about the well-being of the poor, the abused, or the vulnerable, then I can't imagine how any of us could speak from this pulpit about Judaism with any integrity at all. At the beginning of the 5th century, the leaders of the early church in the Eastern Roman Empire became aware of a young man named Simon, a shepherd's son from southern Turkey. Simon had zealously embraced the teachings of the church, taking on a personal devotion to asceticism and self-denial as a sign of his faith. He constructed a tall stone pillar, 50 feet high, widened at the top to form a small platform. He climbed up to the top of it and made an oath that he would stay there, separated from the sin and corruption of the world below, to demonstrate his devotion to God. Simon spent the next 37 years on top of that pillar, praying all day and subsisting only on small morsels of bread soaked in goat's milk that were lifted up to him in a small pail at the end of a rope. Simon never came down until the day he died, and because of his vow to remain pure in faith, removed from the wickedness of the world, Simon Stylites was canonized as a saint and is still revered today in the Coptic Orthodox Church. With respect to that church and to its beliefs, Jewish tradition would never venerate a person like Simon Stylites, because to express one's religion by removing oneself from the affairs of the world, by physically distancing oneself from the need and the hunger and the pain of those around us, is anathema to Jewish belief and Jewish ethics. To be a faithful Jew means to be intimately concerned about those around you and to accept a sacred duty to move through the world in a humble posture of care and compassion. And so in Judaism, we must make room for politics in the most literal sense of that word, originally from the Greek, meaning concerned with the well-being of the city. Our religion as Jews must be clearly and instinctively responsive to the realities of the places where we live. Let me also hasten to note that a Judaism which rejects politics out of hand would be scarcely recognizable to us today. A Judaism that rejects politics could not produce a Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society or an American Jewish Committee to advocate for the well-being of Jews around the world. A Judaism that rejects politics would be a Judaism that fails to stand with our elected officials when they oppose anti-Semitism, vitally important in our nation today, where more than half of the Jewish population reports that anti-Semitism makes us feel less safe than we did 5 years ago. And a Judaism which rejects politics would be one in which there could be no Zionism, the most important liberatory influence in all of Jewish history. So I am not advocating a Judaism beyond politics. But these days, the fine line between politics and partisanship has eroded. Nearly every topic seems supercharged with partisan valence. In this sacred space, we must strenuously avoid confusing moral advocacy for partisan agitation. It used to be easy to have a conversation about an issue of civic concern with a neighbor who votes differently than you do. But it feels different now. Even basic concepts that should be ideologically neutral, the factual realities of science, history, medicine, things that never used to be political have now become identified with partisan ideology. And I will say with some disappointment that many Jewish organizations have been complicit in blurring the lines between moral principles and partisan ones. No, our reform institutions have not stayed above the fray, and at times have exacerbated it. Jewish political engagement is not a new phenomenon, I know, but it has increased dramatically over the last few years. Our Synagogues Association, our Rabbis Union, have moved strongly into political advocacy in ways that frequently cross the line into partisan activism, openly lobbying for or against specific presidential nominations, and pieces of federal legislation which, though many of us feel strongly about them, have few discernible connections to the practice of Judaism. That's why I worry about the shifting boundaries of clergy work and about what core Jewish functions may be neglected in favor of political agendas. I understand that for many American Jews, politics are an expression of their spiritual mission. And as one who serves this pulpit, I understand the motivation of my colleagues who are energized by that work, for whom it feels vital to weigh in on matters of national concern, who believe that party activism can increase Judaism's relevance and prolong its cultural longevity. But I disagree with them. While it is clear that rabbis can help advance political causes, politics will not advance the cause of Judaism. I get it. These are extraordinary times. Everything around us feels so intense, so fraught with consequence, at times frightening and unsettling. We move breathlessly through 24-hour news cycles of fear and anger with attention spans shaved razor thin by social media. But we need to forge a way back from all of this. We can't trade in our spiritual heritage for a generator of social outrage. We rabbis have to do the work that we are uniquely qualified to do, present a voice of conscience and morality that rises above the infotainment scuffles of partisan politics. If we can't succeed in doing so, it will in the end be corrosive to our calling and to our people. In Pirkei Avot, the 2nd century handbook for moral instruction, the ancient sages wrote the following guideline for rabbis. Do not use the Torah as a crown to exalt yourself or as a spade with which to dig. By this, they mean that the richness of Torah becomes degraded if we use it to achieve our temporary desires of ego or of political expediency. If the borders of American Judaism become indistinguishable from the borders of one American political party or another, we will have wiped away the subtlety and nuance that makes American Judaism more timeless than politics and much more interesting too. Because Torah is also much bigger than politics. Reducing Jewish tradition to partisan talking points diminishes its breadth and depth. Our heritage is deep and nuanced, incredibly elegant and subtle. Its complexity contains multitudes. Virtually any hotly debated topic you could name has cogent, compelling, and authentically Jewish arguments to be made on both sides. If you think that Judaism uniformly, neatly fits into a single ideological category, much less a single political party, you're almost certainly oversimplifying our faith. Finally, it's important to point out that if Judaism were reduced to a simple political expression, it would become a narrow monolith, lacking one of the most unique aspects of being Jewish, the experience of in-betweenness, of defying neat compartmentalization into categories like left or right, race or ethnicity, which are transcended by Jewish peoplehood. In his 1990 memoir, Julius Lester wrote about his experience of being black and Jewish as a university professor. He relates a story about how his Jewish values prompted him to publicly and vocally oppose President Reagan's social policies, which won high praise from his liberal colleagues. But he soon found himself shunned by them a short time later when he criticized the anti-Semitism in the writing of James Baldwin. The story is a perfect encapsulation of what it means to be Jewish, partly at home in some places and partly in others, but never completely at ease, except when we are here, among our people. So how do we get back from all of this? How do we dial down the political outrage and come back to who we were meant to be together? On this day of teshuvah, of spiritual return, maybe our way home begins with a reaffirmation of the basic principles we share, the infinite value of human beings, and the divine presence which commands us to care for each other. Maybe our way home begins with a willingness to deepen our commitment to the fundamental practices which form the bedrock under our feet: study and prayer, charity and service, holy time and holy space. It is okay for the synagogue to be a place where you occasionally feel unsettled. I think that's unavoidable, even desirable, if we want this to be a place where we encounter deep truths about the universe, where we come to meet surprising texts and unfamiliar ideas. A synagogue should be a source of both comfort and agitation, applied in proper proportions and held in tension. It's okay with me if you occasionally feel uncomfortable here, because productive discomfort is how we grow. Back in the old days, the Reform movement used to refer to itself as prophetic Judaism, tracing its roots to the legacy of the ancient Hebrew prophets. Those prophets were known for their raging critiques of the social order of the day. They were angry and productive and disruptive, preaching fire and brimstone to subvert the status quo, jarring people out of their habits and their complacency, howling at kings and priests who had grown comfortable in their ivory towers, far from the needs and concerns of everyday people. There's a passage in one of Chekhov's short stories in which the narrator fantasizes about taking a little hammer and going to hide in the homes of all the town's wealthiest and most influential people, creeping quietly out when their backs are turned to knock them on the head gently as a reminder of the people who are suffering outside their walls. The prophets of our Bible saw themselves like that man with the hammer, trying to bang some awareness into other people's heads and wake them up to what's most important. Don't get distracted by the pageantry of the temple, they said, by the music or the fine robes or the offerings. What's important and what matters most is humble faith, genuine charity, heartfelt concern for those in need. Sometimes we find ourselves drawn to that kind of impulse in religious leadership too. The kind that yearns to disrupt the status quo by wielding a hammer over its head, ready to pound the world into alertness. But that's not all the prophets did. They also came to comfort Israel, to soothe the people's worried hearts, to remind them of God's nearness and God's love. They wrote those words that we put on the wall of the sanctuary as a reminder that we can sanctify and ennoble our lives when we commit ourselves to justice and mercy and humility. Yes, Jewish activism can include social grievance, but it cannot be limited by it. Real prophetic Judaism must remind us of the therapeutic value of our heritage of prayer and Torah and the ethical commandments that make us a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. When the world around us is on fire, the synagogue should be the place we come to draw water. So much of this year has been a story called "I Didn't Sign Up for This." Looking back on it from this pulpit, I watched as the pandemic pressed clergy people across the country into responsibilities we never sought and seldom enjoyed. But we fulfilled them just as you fulfilled yours, as an exercise of our freedom of the pulpit and in service of the religious and political imperative to help keep our city healthy and safe. At the same time, we have seen the divide spreading between those who want to widen the space for politics in the American synagogue and those who fear that this impulse will strain the freedom of the pulpit and edge us beyond the vital core of what we are here to do. Our Jewish community will move out of pandemic mode soon. I believe that we will. But when we do, we'll need to remain thoughtful about how we trace the boundaries of our areas of civic and political concern. Narrow enough to avoid generic universalism, but wide enough to preserve our moral obligation to those who suffer and starve while we pray in our holiday finery. Like all of our other liberties, this cherished freedom of our pulpit and freedom of our pews require responsibility and sacrifice. And like all our other liberties, their highest purpose is served when we use them to elevate ourselves and lift up others, to use what we have to bring the world we wish for into existence. In short, to live our lives visibly and proudly as Jews, not from the top of some lofty tower, but among our fellow citizens, bound by the eternal spiritual values that unite us. In the end, I promise you, this will be the most important and enduring political action any of us can undertake. Gemar Chatima Tova. May we all be inscribed for blessing in this new year.